Hello, everyone. My name is Ken Corts, and I'm the Interim Dean of the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. It's a great honor to welcome you all to tonight's event. Rotman's very proud to co-host this live stream along with Indigo Books. For those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. And to our alumni, faculty, staff, and all our regular viewers, it's great to have you back. Although this event is taking place virtually, we wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, Toronto is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I have the great pleasure tonight of introducing our speakers, Bill Gates and Ariel Bissett. Ariel Bissett is a Canadian writer and filmmaker. She's a prolific content creator and has amassed a huge following on her YouTube channel with over 250,000 subscribers. It's a place where she tries to encourage everyone to pick up a book. Ariel has interviewed some of the world's most well-known figures and authors, including people like Michelle Obama, Margaret Atwood, and Bill Gates. She's also the creator of Books Unbound, a weekly podcast. Bill Gates is co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and founder of Breakthrough Energy. Along with co-chair Melinda Gates, he leads the foundation's development of strategies and sets the overall direction of the organization. And at Breakthrough Energy, Bill's putting his experience as an innovator and problem solver to work to address climate change by supporting the next generation of entrepreneurs, big thinkers, and clean energy technologies. And of course, Bill is also the author of How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, the Solutions We Have and the Breakthroughs We Need, published by Penguin Random House Canada on February 16th of this year. Bill, congratulations on the publication of this important book. We're proud to be hosting the Canadian launch. For the next hour, Ariel will lead Bill in conversation and take live questions from the audience. If you have a question, please submit it during the discussion by visiting slido.com, that's slido.com, and entering the event code GATES, G-A-T-E-S. Now we'll kick off the event with a short video to set the stage for their conversation.
In a typical year, the world emits over 51 billion tons of greenhouse gases. And as we keep doing that, the consequences for human life will be catastrophic. When I first fell in love with computers as a teenager, they were enormous, expensive, and only the government and big companies could afford them. But my friends and I became obsessed with a wild idea. What could we do if there was a computer on every desk? And now the wild idea is quite tame. Billions of people not only have computers on their desks, but even in their pockets. Now the world needs another breakthrough. In fact, it needs many breakthroughs. We need to get from 51 billion tons to zero while still meeting the planet's basic needs. That means we need to transform the way we do almost everything. Our commitment to developing these innovations will mean the difference between a future where everyone can live a healthy, productive life and one where we're constantly dealing with the human and financial crises at a historic scale. Entrepreneurs and investors have to build new businesses and change existing businesses to get these solutions deployed. Government leaders have to enact new policies that drive the market for clean energy. And advocates have to keep their voices loud to hold all of us accountable for rapid progress. Avoiding a climate disaster will be one of the greatest challenges humans have ever taken on. Greater than landing on the moon, greater than eradicating smallpox, even greater than putting a computer on every desk. And my basic optimism about climate change comes from my belief in innovation. It's our power to invent that makes me hopeful.
All right. Hello, Bill. How are you doing?
Great. Super to be here with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Good evening to everybody that is watching. Thank you to Ken for that introduction. Congratulations to whoever edited that video, because that was beautifully done. And thank you to the Rotman School of Management and Indigo Books for hosting Indigo Books, the place where I've spent so much of my money. I am Ariel Bissett, and welcome to this discussion with Bill Gates on his book, how to avoid a climate disaster. I feel like any opportunity to show it, right? Any opportunity. How to avoid a climate disaster, the solutions we have, and the breakthroughs we need. Tonight, we will hear from Bill about his path to climate work and his decision to write this book before moving to some questions from our audience. And because it isn't every day that I get to chat with you, Bill, I'm also going to ask you about some specific things I'm really interested about, like trains and heat pumps. I made them accept my questions on trains and heat pumps, and I'm pretty excited. So let's start at the beginning. When people think Bill Gates, they think about Microsoft and they think about the Gates Foundation, but they probably don't yet think about climate change innovation and awareness. In your book, you wrote, I came to focus on climate change in an indirect way through the problem of energy poverty. So what made you start learning about climate change? What is it that really was that impetus?
Yeah, so the year 2000 was when I established the Gates Foundation with my wife. And so that got me traveling to Africa quite a bit. And so I was looking and seeing there was essentially no electricity, and started thinking, well, we need to get electricity here to create jobs, to keep vaccines cold so people have lights at night. And I knew that climate change might be a serious constraint on how that got done, that we couldn't just do it the same way we'd done it in other countries. And I was also seeing that the climate there in Africa, the farmers were having a tougher time. And so I started sitting down with experts and getting them to tell me, what is a climate model and what do we really know? Will the ice melt? Why do we have this problem? And where do all these emissions come from? And so it was in 2010 when I gave a TED Talk about climate. That one's not nearly as famous as the pandemic one I did 5 years later.
I was about to say, is it as viral as the pandemic one? And should it be? And are we going to be a few years from now very scared that it isn't as viral?
Absolutely. Yeah. I got 7 million views on the climate and 37 million on the pandemic. But the sad thing about the pandemic was before the pandemic hit, it was 1 million views. So people watched the video after it was valuable for them. Yeah. So, I hope we can say that's not the case here.
Yeah.
2015, I got involved in the Paris climate talks to help get innovation on that agenda. And I funded a group called Breakthrough Energy that funds new ideas. And then as I saw that young people were caring more about this problem and that this 2050 goal was going to be super hard but achievable, I decided to write up what are the key metrics and what are the key things I've learned, so people wouldn't have to meet with quite as many experts as I did. And, I almost came out with a book last year, but that would have been a very bad timing. This year it's worked out well because a lot of governments, including the US and Europe, are taking their post-pandemic recovery money and programming it against some of these climate-related goals. And so, so far, so good, mostly good reviews.
Yeah, I mean, oh God, am I allowed to say I loved it? I had such a great time reading it. I was sent an ebook version, and I hate reading ebooks. I'm not pretentious, I promise, guys. I just love flipping a page. I was sent this ebook version, and I was like, okay, I'll start reading the ebook version, and I'll wait until I get the physical one. But I binged the whole book on my e-reader because I really enjoyed it. Okay, you mentioned you were spending time mainly in Africa. You were seeing these problems and understanding that this energy crisis was far more complicated than it might be. And one of the things, I think it was the thing that scared me the most in the book was here's a quote. Most experts agree that as we electrify other carbon intensive processes like making steel and running cars, the world's electricity supply will need to double or even triple by 2050. And that doesn't even account for population growth or the fact that people will get richer and use more electricity. So, terrifying. That's so scary, right? Because it's not even we need to make all of the electricity that we have now green. It's that we need to make it all green and make more of it. So how does that work? What are the kind of pieces of that puzzle? But I guess more importantly, how do we pull that off? Like, why are you optimistic?
Yeah, it's a huge opportunity for the utilities or anybody who's involved in power generation or transmission lines. The energy's got to come from somewhere. And so if you don't burn the gasoline in the cars or the natural gas to heat your house, you're switching that energy onto electricity. And in North America, the demand for electricity has been pretty flat for decades. So this is a completely new mode to go into. And as you say, we've got to triple it, we've got to make it clean, and we've got to keep it cheap and reliable. And electricity is actually pretty cheap, but people are very keen on that not changing. Now we're lucky that in North America we have lots of solar and lots of wind, but we don't have much transmission to move it around. In fact, even a transmission line from Canada down into New England is being blocked, for what I think are incorrect reasons. The transmission for that new big grid will have to be gigantic. And remember, we're not going to add that much hydro, so that 20% doesn't go up. A lot of people wonder, about the nuclear percentage, whether that should go up or down, and maybe we'll touch on that later. But you caught what is was a surprising thing to me as I studied the area, was how much electricity we're going to need, because it's really the only clean energy that we know how to move around. We hope we can get clean hydrogen and move that around somewhat, but that's still unclear.
Well, speaking of surprises and challenges, I guess, thinking, because like I said, I'm reading this book and I'm thinking, oh my God, I did not realize that not only do we have to switch it all, we have to make more of it. Another thing that really surprised me, and whenever I have been talking to people about this, everyone I talk to is surprised about this. And you phrase it in the book, you ask everyone, what's your plan for cement? It's the fact that making stuff is our biggest sector of problem. It makes up, what do I have written here? 31% of our emissions you have in this kind of making stuff category: cement, steel, fertilizer. So why is cement and kind of what that represents something we need to think about? And yeah, I don't know, I'm nervous. Bill, I'm nervous.
Sure. No, this is a tough problem. Without the young generation really saying this must be a priority in the rich countries and driving that innovation, I don't think we'll solve it, because we're changing out a lot of the physical economy. It was a big surprise to me. The sectors that people kind of expect are electricity, because they know there's coal plants and natural gas plants, and cars, because they fill up their gas tank. That's only between those about a third of the emissions. The rest of transportation, buses, trains, planes, the agriculture sector, which includes cows that emit methane, which is after CO2 the biggest greenhouse gas. We got heating and cooling, but the biggest sector of the five, exactly as you said, is manufacturing. And that is so well developed and so cheap, we just take it for granted. We want roads, get cement. We want big buildings, that's got steel and cement. You want cars, that's using steel. And so it's daunting that now we've added almost every physical good that you can look at, paper, plastic, all these things are, there has to be a change in that process. And yet, our people aren't willing to pay a whole lot more than they pay today. So that's what drives towards innovation, which that's, I'm a huge believer in innovation, although, it's very hard to predict how quickly we can make it arrive.
Yeah, I guess when I'm trying to think of this from the perspective of the average citizen. The average Canadian citizen is sitting here, is listening to Bill Gates say, we need to innovate in cement. And most of us can't do that, right? Most of us can't innovate in cement or steel. wouldn't even know how. So is that, by the way, I mean, I think we have basically matching mugs if I cover up my blue part. Yeah, go team. If you are someone who's sitting here and thinking, okay, so how do I affect change in the making stuff category? What is it that you sort of suggest or hope is what we can do, is the actionable point? I need an actionable goal.
Yeah, the first step is the broad knowledge of this and sharing that with friends. And, no matter what their political persuasion is, we need everyone to get on board with the goal, even though they can, fight over exactly the right tactics in terms of government versus private sector and all that. As you're working with various companies, choosing the products you buy, they're all going to be reporting their emissions. And some of them, as they build new buildings, will be among the first buyers for green steel and green cement. And so we have to shift the economy, starting in small volume, like we did with solar panels. In that case, it was Japan and Germany were willing to subsidize them, and that brought the price down. And then other countries came in, and now they're very, very cheap. In fact, if they would run 24 hours a day, then the whole electricity thing would actually be pretty simple. But because that doesn't work, we need that grid with all those additional elements. So you will see how companies are behaving on these things. Even the car you buy, yes, the primary thing is the fuel, the electric car, but electric car companies will differentiate each other in terms of how is that steel that goes into the car made. And so, the voice of the consumer for many things, whether it's beef or steel, actually can start to drive the volume of the green approach.
So do you believe with that maxim that's like vote with your dollar? Do you think that's a good way to kind of think about this?
Yes, I think your political voice is the first thing.
Okay. Voting
with your dollar is the second thing. And then making sure the company you work for is a very good citizen on these issues is the third thing there. And, when I say your political voice, I do include, in a calm way, trying to draw people in, because this thing where in the US we have one party who I worry thinks it's too easy to solve the problem, but they agree it's important, and another party who, at least some members, still don't see this as a priority. That's a problem when you're saying, hey, every year of this 30 years, we've got to use them all, not 4 years on, 4 years off. This is, and the capital investments we're asking the companies to make in hundreds of billions, if they don't think the policies favor that, if there's any uncertainty, they're not going to take the risk. And so, some type of coming together on the goal will be important. And that's really, young people who want to have a moral cause beyond their own success, that they're speaking out about the topic.
I think you put it really, really succinctly. There's three branches. So vote politically, making sure that both federal, but also local, obviously local government can make so much change. Vote with your dollar, and then try and affect change in your own workplace. Something I don't know if you care, Bill, but something I'm really excited about is digging more into the publishing industry and seeing like how much of the paper that books are published with use recycled paper. Like, it's such a specific thing. But it's like every industry, you can push that needle a little bit, right?
Yeah, which then, drives demand, and then people will bring the extra cost down.
Yeah. Same with like me always buying Beyond Meat at A&W, not sponsored by A&W, but it's the only place around me that has it. And so my hope is that by buying it, they won't take it off the menu.
Good job. That's great.
Okay, well, I'm already on your side. Obviously, I agree. We need climate change help. We need to take it seriously. And I know that a lot of people watching are the same. We've all watched the documentaries. We've read your book or read other books like it. What do you say to people who are more pessimistic about it, that think either it isn't something that they need to pay attention to because maybe they're living in a country like the US or Canada that's probably going to be fine, or the effects will take a long time to show up? What would you say to someone who is more pessimistic, or someone who doesn't think that we can do anything about it? Like maybe they think, yeah, climate change is here, but we can't really change it.
Yeah, the damage of climate change, you always have to keep coming back to how every year it gets worse and worse. And if you get all the way out to the end of the century, the sea level rise, the natural ecosystems that completely go away, the fact the world won't be livable near the equator, and these farmers who are trying to work outdoors won't be able to do that. You know, you always have to keep that in mind because we need almost a warlike priority for this and sustained over a long time. It's true that Canada, because it's cold, it's not going to be too hot to work outside. But if you look at the north of Canada and what the warming means for the ecosystems up there, you know, starting with the Arctic ice, and then as that gets a lot harder, it is really changing faster than any of the plants or birds can evolve to adjust to this thing. If it was like, 100 times slower, that would be what has happened during evolutionary history, and everything could adjust. So there's a lot to be said for the world, being stable and not letting this happen. I'm optimistic because I know that human ingenuity is at its peak. The number of people who are educated, the ability to share information on the internet, even, take like Carbon Cure, which is a Canadian company that's got a partial solution for cement. Their idea is you stick the CO2 back into the cement. And when they first said that, I'm like, what? What do you mean you stick it back in there? It's air, but in fact, they can take some of the calcium and even maintaining all the good properties of cement, react that into those pores. Or there was a company that came along that said you can just find the right place, and this is true in the US and Canada, and just pump water into the ground, and the pressure will come back out and let you recover that energy. So it's using just water pressure, where there's no hill with the big reservoir or anything like you normally think of hydro energy storage. They're just pumping it into ground formations that exist anywhere. Now, we don't know that won't work. It's an amazing company called QuidNet. But I'm lucky I get to see dozens of these things.
Right.
And even with an 80% failure rate, if we push hard and have, hundreds of amazing ideas like this, and we get the small companies working with the big companies, we get the government demand and consumers who are willing to not only spend a little bit extra, but over time we'll have a fund called Catalyst that people can pay into to buy down the super green products. And I have to admit, part of my optimism is just I'm an optimistic person. Part of it is that in both my careers, my software and my foundation work, where it's global health, we made way more progress. Both cases, turned out way better than I expected. And, so I hope I'm not being fooled by that experience, because I do know this involves so much more physical change. Most people, if they looked up how many cement plants, are in Canada, or how many, steel plants are in North America, they'd be surprised. We rely on that stuff, and it's very, very cheap.
So interesting. I think it's really exciting that you get to find out from all of these different companies who have crazy ideas. That's not, it's like a science fair, right? But like the world stakes on the shoulders of those projects. So what are you doing about the problem of climate change? Like, what is going to be your approach moving forward? You've now published the book, which is obviously massive for advocacy. But what is going to be kind of the things that you're investing in and pushing forward and planning?
Yeah, so the pipeline of innovation starts with R&D, and that was that 2015 event that Justin Trudeau came to. I remember I got to talk to him quite a bit because Obama was having a meeting with Modi, and so he was late, and so Trudeau and I and a bunch of the world leaders were just kind of cooling our heels for about 30 minutes there. So we got to discuss this. So, Canada committed to raise its R&D,
Right.
and it actually was able to come through on that. Then after the government R&D piece, you need smart people to get funding, whether they're ready to form a company. If they're not, maybe some philanthropic funding. If they have a company, then just like Carbon Cure, investors who are willing to focus on climate priorities and take risks should be able to evaluate, does this really work? And so Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which I created to fund companies like that in 2015, is one of their backers. And then we need to create demand. This is why I use this word catalyst. When you first make steel that's green, that is, there's no emissions associated with it, it costs a lot more. The green premium starts high. And who wants to buy this overpriced steel? It's not better in some way. In fact, because the recipe is slightly different, people might even worry, is it as good? Will it get brittle or rust or some, negative steel-like characteristic? And
you wouldn't want bad steel or cement. It's a nightmare.
yes, the recipe works. Why tinker with it? Well, the climate change is the answer to that. And so we have to be open-minded. And some of the government regulations, the building codes, the government is a buyer, the wealthy companies like the tech companies can be buyers here. The products that get all the way to the individual person, like the artificial meat, that's the ideal case, because they're, when Impossible and Beyond got offered, the demand was actually greater than they expected. And so now they have the money to go and do another version, to make it cheaper, to make it, their goal is pretty quickly to actually fool you so you can't even tell whether it's the cow stuff or the non-cow stuff.
Right. I can't tell, honestly. I'm at this point.
Yeah, if you put enough ketchup on, I can't tell either.
Well, you're talking about your buddy Justin Trudeau. I'm curious about how do I guess, Canada, I love it, but we have a small population in the grand scheme of things, right? And we're very lucky. We're a very privileged and wealthy country. But we don't have that big of a population. So why is it important for a country like Canada to still participate in trying to battle climate change? Because I can imagine, and you talk about this in your book, where there's this delicate balance where it's like, we all need to work on this problem, but if only a few people work on it, they have the most to lose, even though we all need the solution to it.
Yeah, that cooperation problem is one of the things that makes this a very difficult problem. There are just pure humanitarian reasons why, foreign aid is given to buy vaccines, and, Canada's been good on that. Canada's a partner of our foundation in global health work. The same thing is true here, where you're talking about millions of people who their crops will fail, they won't be able to work outdoors, and you'll have a scale of migration that the world has never seen, because the equatorial regions will just get so difficult. You'll actually have anything that's up in the permafrost areas, as that starts to melt, that's also very bad. So parts of Canada and Alaska will see those problems. The reason we should do this really is humanitarian. The rich countries have had the greatest emissions historically. Per person, the US and Canada and Australia are among the worst. That is, we drive more miles, we have to heat our houses a lot, our houses tend to be bigger. And so by rights, because of our wealth, our past emissions, that priming this innovation pump, that should be our responsibility. Now, the nice thing is that, companies like Carbon Cure, they hire people, they export their product, throughout the world. So in a way, it's getting in on the next big industry, which is, doing things in a green way. And in the same way that countries like the US that fund health research, that's a favor to the world, but we end up with good companies, and it all has worked out. Climate is like that. That we need these solutions. The research jobs or high-paying jobs, the actual production, should be broad. And in some ways, we need to put those jobs, if possible, where the hydrocarbon industry will experience the reduction in demand, and kind of matching up, okay, who's the winner, who's the loser. That gets very tricky. And of course, you have that in Canada, where some parts of the country do a great job on hydrocarbons, likewise in the US. And we have to try, even though we have to try and balance out, how does that new opportunity show up and not leave some communities completely behind. But the R&D, those adjustment processes, I view this as, hey, it's going to happen. So let's get there. Let's lead the way.
Well, leading the way, in my opinion, is trains. And so I really wanted to ask you about trains, because this is, I guess, really, it's just my personal dream is that I can get on a train and go anywhere in Canada. I love going on the train. And obviously, we're talking about climate change. Airplanes are so bad for the climate. And so I'm like, why can't we just have this massive, incredible train system that helps us travel? Obviously, we have this smaller population, but we have such a giant country. So getting from one end to the other is such a problem. So why don't we have more trains? And I think about this with the States as well. Like, why don't we have more trains? Is that a system that could work? Electric trains? Please convince me or tell me the truth, Rick. Let me know if I'm deluded.
When we think of trains, we have to think of two different things. We have trains for freight and trains for passengers. And what's amazing is that North America, in terms of trains for freight, is actually super good. That is, you can drop off goods in LA and get them up to Chicago very inexpensively. There's basically 6 Class A railroads, Canadian National that I own a part of, Canadian Pacific, and then we have 2 in the West, Union Pacific and Burlington Northern, which my friend Warren Buffett owns, and then we have the 2 in the East. So it's just the 6 railroads, but when it comes to freight, it's absolutely phenomenal. Now, because we love cars and we built so many roads, the habit is not there as much to ride the train. Amtrak was this big US passenger thing that spectacularly went bankrupt. And so it's not as common. It'd be good to revive that, but our system is very optimized for these trains going like 25 miles an hour to move the freight. So it's a little bit more difficult than you'd expect to layer passenger on top of that. Ironically, Europe is the opposite of us. Europe has very good passenger trains, but their freight costs and infrastructure are not nearly as good as ours. Part of the reason their passenger train stuff is so good is their gas taxes are very high. And so it's less attractive to take some super long distance journey. And they've maintained things there. So yes, transportation, getting to where we're using more electricity. Now, as you get bigger and bigger things like trucks and trains and certainly planes, we may need to use green fuels instead of electricity directly. So green diesel to put in that train locomotive and green aviation fuel to put into those planes. But that's one of those areas where we're just at the beginning. I'm personally a big customer for this green aviation fuel so that I can, say that I've gotten rid of my carbon emissions and that I'm using that money that I spend $7 million a year to help bootstrap demand for important green products, including that aviation fuel.
Right. Well, before we go to Q&A, I have to ask you one last question. I just bought a very old house. It is from the 1850s, and it is absolutely terrible for all sorts of green goods. It leaks heat like crazy, and it has a 40-year-old furnace that I've named Wilbur because he's an old man. He's such a terrible furnace. I constantly I just want to kick him, but he is getting me through this winter. But eventually I want to upgrade to a heat pump. And so I was so excited when I was reading about heat pumps in your book. And what really surprised me was that it's one of these examples of innovation not being the problem. It's advocacy that's the problem. So I wondered, why are you also excited about heat pumps, and what can we do in situations where it isn't innovation, it's advocacy?
Yeah, it was surprising to me to find a few areas like heat pumps where it's just the awareness isn't there. Now, it's the classic case that you pay more up front to buy it, and then your electric bill is less than your diesel or natural gas bill would have been. And so, that type of thing that you pay a little bit more now and you get that benefit over time. Consumers are a little bit risk averse to that, and sometimes the government or some private sector financing entity should come in and help make that more obvious to people. Thank goodness that heat pumps for most locations are better because they combine heating and cooling better than directly burning hydrocarbons. And so we need to drive that adoption. Now, the electricity company needs to make sure they're not falling behind on their capacity. And it really raises this issue of reliability in a pretty dramatic way, because if you're locally, you've got a tank of diesel or something, you haven't been that dependent on delivery. You have that buffer of the tank. Whereas if your electricity, it doesn't run, then just even basic warmth gets to be a challenge there. So this is a whole area that I expect will be greatly accelerated. We'll have some tax credits for heat pumps. We'll have consumer awareness for heat pumps. The case where it's really, really clear is when you're building a new house. Retrofitting to an old house is a little trickier, but even there, I bet the majority of houses would benefit.
Well, awesome. I will get a heat pump, I promise. Let's see how many questions we can answer from the audience. We've got a lot of really good ones. John asks, what is more important for policy change? Electing officials who back climate change, or investing in companies that are working on climate change solutions?
Well, yeah, we need both of those things. And sadly, the government is so important here. When you're trying to transition from a very low volume product that looks like it might not be as good, electric cars, the government policies have been great there. They drove down the prices, and so in 15 years, the idea that GM says they're not going to make any gasoline cars, nobody goes crazy and thinks, oh, that's a bad thing, because the car will have improved, the batteries, the range, everything. And so, we'll have a zero green premium. And so government and politicians who are enlightened on this, we can't do it without them, particularly in the rich countries where the R&D policies and the deployment policies, we need to set an example for all the other countries and get the learning curve, get the price down so you can see global adoption.
Okay, Greg asks, what industries do you see being the biggest bottleneck or slow to adopt to converting to green energy? What are we most scared of?
Well, I'd say these manufacturing businesses, because they're kind of relegated to where, like even take a Department of Energy in the US or Canada, they may not have that much expertise about steel or cement, because the word energy actually doesn't really include those things. Mm-hmm. They're gas emitting things, greenhouse gas emitting. So, now we're pulling them in, and we don't really have a word that, we use this term energy, but it's more than just energy, like cows farting is not, that's not really energy, but it is greenhouse gases. So that industrial sector where, their margins aren't high, their R&D budget isn't high, they compete with international manufacturers who might not be subject to the same regulations. And so that, particularly in the case of steel, in cement, it's a lot of smaller companies. And so, I worry the most about that. The electric companies, because they get to grow, they have upside. they can be very articulate. But manufacturing is going to be the last sector to convert.
I really wish I could help more with cement. I just don't know anything about it. We have a question from Bodhi, and it says that they're 8 years old. So we've got people caring from a very young age. Fantastic. What did it feel like for you to write a book about climate change? And I'm curious about how long it took you to put it together.
Well, I had my 15 years of learning. And so the most difficult thing is to boil that down in a way that's approachable. Climate involves chemistry and economics and, politics and physics. And you don't want to be kind of showing off that, hey, here's another, crazy term. And I, set a goal to be a fairly short book and yet, cover the kind of outline of what the key metrics are and what a plan would look like. So I was pleased when it came together. If I'd tried to write the book 5 years in or 10 years into my learning journey, I wouldn't have been able to pull it together that way. Writing a book about something is sort of the ultimate test of, do you really understand it well? And I've had, maybe 50 times where somebody said to me, please explain climate. And I've gone to the board, or, maybe we're on a plane flight or a car trip. And so that was kind of my tryout for, okay, I made it too complicated that time, or I explained a few things right. So it was a long time in the making, but, there were about 3 months that I focused on this. A number of edit passes. I had a, co-collaborator, Josh Daniel, who helped me a lot. And, I find the topic fascinating. You said, it's like a science fair. Yes. And I love a science fair. I love, the history of all these things. There's another Canadian, Václav Smil, who is brilliant. His books are a little bit longer, but if you really want to understand energy and civilization, or many aspects of energy, he's the one to go to. I benefited so much from his knowledge.
The first time that you and I ever sat down to talk, it was about your favorite climate change books, and you talked about one of Smil's books, and I got to take it home. I don't know if I was allowed, but I definitely took it home. So now I'm going to put your book next to his. It's going to be in my climate change section. So that's cool.
Excellent.
Yeah, I also think it's hilarious that someone on a plane is asking you to explain climate change next to Bill Gates. What is climate change? Yilmaz asks, what are some of the key takeaways in your view for government and corporate sector from COVID-19 that could help tackle the climate change challenge? I think this is really cool because we've obviously learned a lot, maybe some depressing things, but we've learned a lot about how government is dealing with a large scale crisis. So how do you take and process some of what's been going on with the pandemic to what we have to do with climate?
Yeah, so climate is just another thing that we trust our government to hire experts and make sure that they're investing on our behalf so we don't, suffer. And governments, when it comes to earthquakes, they have building codes. When it comes to, wars, they do simulations or war games. They fund the defense budget. And here we have two things, pandemics and climate change, where governments haven't stepped up the way they should. Mm-hmm. And so I hope the pandemic is not only a lesson specifically to be ready for the next pandemic, so, we don't see this again.
Don't say there's another one coming.
Well, there's a chance there is, but we know so much more about quick diagnosis and getting vaccines out quick that if you give us, say, 5 to 10 years and governments remember that they need to buy this insurance policy, I think, this pandemic 10 years from now would essentially be nothing. It would be even better than it was, say, in Australia, who had quite a good epidemic because they did the diagnosis quickly and kept the numbers down very dramatically. Now, climate change is a looming problem. It's not something that you can let it develop and then get out of it, because the lead time to change all this infrastructure is many decades. In fact, when I think of the 30 years, I think, wow, we better invent almost everything in the next 10, because just the deployment piece at this gigantic scale will take that next 20 years, and that, gets you all the way to 2050. So there is no single thing like a vaccine. You can't wait till you see how bad it is, because it gets worse every year, and it's, built up from all the history of emissions. And so sadly, I'd say it's an even harder problem, but it's got a bigger constituency, and I expect that constituency, the young generation, to grow over time, so that, every government says, okay, it's in our list of priorities.
Yeah. This kind of goes with what you were just saying. Risha asked, what's the most impactful area that local governments and municipalities can focus on? In the book, you stress, like in the ending section where you're talking about action, like what should we do? You talk about being involved in your local government. So what are those areas that local governments can be focusing on?
Well, there's always this trickiness of permitting, whether it's, wind farms or solar or transmission lines. And people have this not in my backyard type attitude. It's particularly strong if we see that nuclear is a key part of the solution. Some people might say, okay, that's fine, but 50 miles away from me, even as we prove that the safety is very, very strong. Local governments decide what the transport infrastructure looks like. Local governments buy buses, and I'd say over the next 5 years, these electric buses are getting to be really economic. That's happening right now in China quite a bit. And so as those prices come down, and an electric bus, it's not only good for the global pollution, greenhouse gas thing, it's really good for having less, diesel fumes and everything as well. And so, local governments buy a lot, they permit a lot. They've got to be part of the solution.
You mentioned China. A question from Anonymous. Maybe they want to be kept secret. Can we achieve zero without China? I mean, that goes to similar to the question of, like, does Canada participating matter? Can we reach zero if other countries aren't working on reaching zero?
No, we cannot. China in the present day numbers is the largest emitter. So the United States was up until about 3 years ago, and they passed us, partly because they export a lot of steel and cement, but they also use a lot. I mean, remember, they're 20% of the world's population. And so their share of emissions almost matches exactly their share of the global population. And they need to participate in every way. They need to help with the innovation. They need to help with the deployment. Now, they can say that their renewable deployment is huge, and they're continuing to do R&D on nuclear to try to make that work. So there are some good things there. Their current climate commitment is to get to zero by 2060, whereas almost all the rich countries have committed to 2050. And so, encouraging them and making sure that in this area of cooperation, that it's a win-win thing, and we're, sharing with each other, helping each other, even though some other things will be more contentious. That's an interesting challenge. John Kerry's the climate envoy now for the Biden administration, and he's reaching out to China to see, how do we rebuild some level of cooperation on this issue, and, see what it would take in terms of innovation or help for them to advance their deadline to get to zero. They're very serious about, okay, whatever they commit to, they want to deliver. So they, when they do make a commitment, I think that will be a big deal.
Jason asks, what is the best way to integrate the topic of climate change into our education system in order to drive passion and interest for the next generation? And you've mentioned how important advocacy and education is. And I know you've done a lot of work with U.S. education. So what is that kind of way to make sure everyone knows exactly what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think the ideal is to use interest in climate to derive interest in science, and interest in science to drive interest in climate. After all, you can do these little experiments, with the greenhouse and see how the heat gets trapped, which is kind of confusing. The heat comes in and it doesn't go out. Well, that's because it goes out at a different wavelength, but, it takes a whole science course to really give you an intuitive feel for that. And so I think it will motivate kids to learn these things. The curriculum, I wouldn't say, is very good right now. My group that does things like history texts, there's one called Big History. We're going to work on a climate change course. I'm sure there'll be lots of them, but we'd like to see kids as young as 8th grade be exposed to this as a concept, that may motivate them as they go into politics or science to be part of the solution.
One thing that you've really taught me a lot about is green premiums. And it's something that I hadn't really thought about in so many words beforehand. And I think it would be awesome if you could explain to everyone watching, what are they and why do they matter so much?
Yeah, so the normal way of making a product and the way to make it where there's no emissions, the green way, the difference in price, that's what I call the green premium. So let me give an example. For an electric car, you pay a bit more. I'm comparing two Chevrolet products here. But it's not dramatic. And over the next 15 years with innovation, even without the tax credit, that should get to zero. Now, cement, on the other hand, because every time you make a ton of cement, you have a ton of emissions. And I'm using $100 a ton for carbon removal. It almost doubles the price of the cement. So that, is a huge deal. That industry, can't double its prices just all of a sudden and expect to retain its customers. So the areas where the green premium is the highest are exactly the areas that need the most attention, because only when green premiums are very small will the developing countries agree to use green approaches in 2050. And they will be responsible by then for such an overwhelming percentage of the emissions that if only the rich countries get to zero, it won't really help much. So our responsibility is, yes, to get rid of our emissions, but also to drive the learning curve across every sector through the understanding of science, the research budgets, the risk-taking capital that North America is a big part of the world's capacity for that.
We have a question here from Ben. The team really wants me to ask this question. Hello, Mr. Gates. Can I call you Bill? Being able to say I'm on a first name basis with Bill Gates would be a great fun fact. Can Ben?
No problem.
Name basis. Fantastic. Congratulations, Ben. I actually had this whole struggle. I was like, can I just say Bill? I'm just going to say Bill. Yeah, that's great. Our last question here is a beautiful ending question. Sean asks, what is it that made you give back to the world, and how can we as a society encourage those in your shoes to do the same? I think that's a really awesome question. When we think about the giant, massive thing that we have ahead of us, we think about people that have all of this power, whether there's a lot of different ways that power can manifest, but obviously having a lot of money and a lot of connections can make such a big difference. So how is it that we can encourage other people that are in a similar position to do great stuff too?
Yeah, I wouldn't take any credit for the quantity of my giving, because I'm lucky to have so much money that I'm not making some huge sacrifice as I give it away. Givers who, giving to their church or causes they believe in, where they're giving up a vacation or some consumption, that in a way is more praiseworthy than what I do. The area that I try is in my quality, that is the impact, by picking global health, by helping to invent new vaccines. In our foundation, we believe we have had a disproportionate effect relative to the resources, and that, we're very proud of what that's resulted in. We've created this thing called the Giving Pledge to try and get all the people of wealth to learn from each other and really set the standard that, you give the majority away. We're also very involved in normal scale giving. We fund this Giving Tuesday, and there's a lot, where people like Teacher's Choice, help give to different schools. So the digital era of giving, where you can find something that's highly impactful and we get people to be more generous, we're not there yet. We have a lot to do to make it clear, okay, what did my gift do? Why should I pick this cause? But I'm hopeful. And so we fund the philanthropic sector. We fund, looking at policies to encourage giving. The rest of the world, is envious that Canada and the US have more giving, but I still, I think, okay, we should have twice as much. How do we innovate even in that space?
Well, I like that as our final question, and now they're telling me to wrap up. So thank you, Bill, for talking to me. Thank you to the Rotman School of Management and to Indigo Books for hosting, and to our viewers in Toronto, but also all over Canada. Again, thank you, Bill, for talking to me, for writing this book, and for using your resources to tackle this issue. I know that so many of us really appreciate that. So have a great evening, Bill, and thank you again to everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ariel and Bill, for this important conversation tonight. It was really informative, inspiring, and practical. I just can't think of a more important topic for us to be discussing, and I'm just so glad that Rotman can play a role in getting that message out. As I listened to how your conversation unfolded, it just made me want to sneak in a plug for two projects at U of T that we're working on as part of our emissions reduction plan, because I think it touches on a couple of the topics you discussed at length. But we're actually building what will be one of North America's tallest buildings that uses primarily structural wood as the elements of construction, which dramatically reduces concrete use. And we're also building North America's largest urban geothermal exchange facility, which is a technology that works alongside heat pumps to dramatically reduce the emissions associated with heating and cooling our buildings. And I say that, a little bit to brag about U of T, but mostly to reinforce your point that so many of the solutions we need are here today and they're ready to be implemented. I think that's a really important message of the book. So thank you both again, and thank you to our audience for tuning in tonight. We hope you enjoyed the live stream. For more events like tonight's, please visit the Rotman Events website. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you.